So over time, Uncle Sam has been personified as an enduring symbol of the United States and its government, especially his excellent ability to point at you. Interesting. We're going to talk about 5 things in government contracting that probably changed your life. Maybe 5 government contracts that changed your life. Coming at you with number 5. And I have a cheat sheet here. Macy's and Sears. We'll do that one. All right, so I'm going to do a little intro for you on this five contracts that changed your life. If you look at government, if you look at U.S. history, you can look at U.S. history just as nothing more than a series of business transactions or contracts. And that is because a lot of American history has been moved through the relationship between the enormous budget that the federal government has and our very, very entrepreneurial and active marketplace in the American industry from the 1700s all the way up into the 2020s. And so I'm going to pick 5 of those. We're going to go through history, U.S. history, significant U.S. history that you probably know a lot of these events in history. And I'm going to explain how government contracts were involved. If you're watching this and you're a contracting officer or you're in procurement, make sure you watch this. Know why your job is so important. We're about to get historical with number 5. We're going to talk about Civil War contracts, mid-1800s. We had, and usually wartime is where a lot of the money came through. In times of war, you have probably the government's primary function at that time was to protect the citizens and fight wars. A lot of restrictions were dropped during wartime, and a lot of companies came and provided that wartime support. Many profited very greatly from these wartime contracts, sometimes to a fault. In the Civil War, we also had something interesting, which was kind of the Industrial Revolution was around that time. And you had this idea of mass production created through machines. So, Civil War, we had way more soldiers than we ever needed in any other war. Unfortunate war fought from within our nation. A lot of American soldiers from both sides needing uniforms from American companies. And the military at that time needed tons of uniforms. And at the time, uniforms were still tailored to your body size, right? A lot of these artisans, so they weren't even like companies who just manufactured clothes. They were very special artisans whose maybe their father and their father's father or daughter, and would make these clothes. The government didn't have the time for that. They needed a whole bunch of clothes, and they didn't need the clothes to be specifically fit for each individual soldier. They needed mass-produced sizes. So they said, give us like small, medium, large. Give us just standard sizes. One size fits all, or 3 sizes fit all, and make those. And when you make your clothes, your uniform, don't think about the particular soldier you're making it for. Doesn't matter. Just make it by size, and then we'll fit it in. So they had military specifications to work on the uniforms there, and then they also had a specification for the storehouses to make sure that the clothes fit in storehouses, and then they didn't know when and where they needed these uniforms. So another sort of difference within industry. Companies were not used to making clothes, then storing them, and having them readily available for easy ordering to who knows where. The soldiers needed to be able to order them from battlefields and have them shipped there. So they wanted some kind of catalog, some kind of way they could flip through and look at maybe by item number, another maybe military specification they had. So this was very unique and new with industry, but the wartime contractors complied. And then, as happens throughout history, during peacetime, after the Civil War, the wartime innovations in processes and in products transferred over dual use into the commercial market. So you had some of these contractors who had to make these big supply houses. Well, they just opened up their supply houses and turned them into department stores. And one of those contractors was Macy's. So Macy's has government contracting to thank for their huge success. Another example are the catalogs that the soldiers needed so they can order things from the field and have them delivered to them. One company that profited from that in peacetime is Sears. So Sears has government contracts to thank for their success. And we as consumers have government contractors to thank for the government contract in creating department stores and catalogs. That's number 5. All right, number 4. Let's go from clothes to high technology. The government was instrumental in creating Silicon Valley. So this is an interesting one. Let's go back to the 1960s when microprocessors were a little bit more well-known, being developed by Fairfield. Is it Fairchild? It's Fairchild. By Fairchild, a company that was pretty much owning the microprocessing market. The government, most of that area in Silicon Valley was funded by research dollars from the Department of Defense or NASA or the Intel community, just pumping in research dollars, allowing some of these companies to grow through government funding. So government funding was coming into the Silicon Valley area. They were almost like the venture capitalist investors at the time in the 1960s. There was one decision that was made in government contracting, though. It was a decision made in Washington, D.C., which impacted the other coast. And that was a decision to start competing among microprocessors. The unit price of a microprocessor was still pretty high. Too high for the government and certainly too high for the consumer. So when they decided to compete, I think something interesting happened, and I don't think the government could have even predicted this. There were workers within Fairchild, that company, that decided to leave Fairchild and create their own company, and Intel is an example. And there's other startups where they were maybe tired of the management of the company they're in, said, hey, let's just start up our own company. Because the government helped kind of stir the pot by sparking up competition, they said, well, let's just compete on this government contract against the company we used to work for. And then that happened, and then there were little subdivisions there of other companies just starting. And through this competitive process, which was made by a decision by someone in D.C. to compete, we have this beginnings of a startup culture in Silicon Valley, which was really created through competition because of how much money was being put in. So Silicon Valley has government contracting decisions to thank for their creation. Number 3, now this one's a little interesting, but Uncle Sam, the beloved mascot of the government, was actually a federal contractor. So I'm going to have to read this. Here's how the story goes. Samuel Wilson was a meat packer from Troy, New York. His company delivered rations to American soldiers in the War of 1812. So he was a contractor during the War of 1812. See a pattern here. Wartime contracting can sometimes, because of the urgency, because of the money that's going into it, and because of the patriotism of just making sure you achieve your goal, create enormous innovations that have great benefits moving into peacetime. All right. But he was a meat packer, and he was helping the American soldiers in 1812, again, a contractor. Per the terms of the contract, he had to stamp U.S. on the meat, which meant United States. But soldiers jokingly described the U.S. stamp as Uncle Sam, which they were referring to the meatpacking contractor. Whenever they saw that stamp, it was like, oh, there's Uncle Sam's meat. So over time, Uncle Sam has been personified as an enduring symbol of the United States and its government, especially his excellent ability to point at you. Interesting. So in GovCon, government professionals, we get a little arm's length about companies and contractors, and maybe even we get suspicious that the companies are only in it for their own profit. They're not mission-oriented. Just keep in mind, Uncle Sam, the very personification of the government itself, was an American government contractor, and I think that's perfect. Because the reality is the mission is accomplished through the cooperation of not only the government, but industry. They become parts of the team to enable government missions, and they are just as patriotic and dedicated to the mission as government workers are. It's a perfect fact to me. That's number 3. Here we go to number 2. Am I counting down?
Yeah, you have been so far.
Okay. Ooh, this one's good. Number 2, way that government contracting has changed your life. Let's talk about going from muskets to software and the concept of interchangeable parts. First introduced by someone named Eli Whitney, at least first introduced to the U.S. government for muskets. Okay, now again, with muskets at the time, each gun, the parts were specifically fitted for that particular gun. And that's because they were handmade. They were made by artisans. And you couldn't just take a part from one gun, put it into the other, and expect it to work. They were specially fitted, very unique, probably pretty valuable today because they were handmade. But we have this new era of interchangeable parts. And what Eli Whitney did is he was a kind of an industrial revolutionary figure that really took advantage of this oncoming industrial revolution. There's a story of him in 1801 going to Washington, D.C., and going to a table where John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and other dignitaries were sitting, and just dumping out a bunch of rifle parts on the table. And he said, I'm going to make 2 guns or whatever. I'm going to make a couple guns from all these parts. You couldn't tell what part went where, and he made the guns. And thus proving that you could use one part and then replace it and have these interchangeable parts, which was incredible for mass production. If a part broke, the whole rifle didn't break. You could just take that part and put it in. Great. Well, what does that have to do with government contracting? And what does that have to do with software? Well, the interesting thing about interchangeable parts was Eli Whitney opened up some of his designs to other companies. So other companies could actually improve the rifle by specializing in maybe certain parts of the gun. And as that translated to other armory and other weapons, other companies could specialize on other aspects of the gun and even specialize in tooling that helped kind of modify the gun. So the government, I think I'm going to fact check this, around 1845, the government decided to open up at one point. They used an open building, kind of like a trade show, and opened up all its blueprints of all its parts and allowed all companies to come and share their ideas to add to blueprints or maybe add their own parts to different things. And so you had this kind of Frankenstein collaboration. So it spurred huge industry participation. Some say that this actually created the explosion of firearms that led to the romanticized Wild West firearms like Colt. And what are some other? Remington, yeah. Henry. All these Wild West shooters made through interchangeable parts, and the explosion in the market due to people like Eli Whitney and the federal government and government contracts. So we have modern application of that today. Let's move over to software. So a way that the government can maybe spur the market with software and maybe have more competition is by opening up code. And that's the idea of opening things up to open source. In the same way that you opened up your blueprints and then people can add a part to a rifle maybe to another piece of the machinery or the gun. You can add code to an existing code or platform through open source, and multiple companies can be part of making something great. It's the same idea. And so if we use the lessons from weaponry from the 1800s and apply it to technology today, we can create maybe even more of an explosion. Again, all thanks to government contracts.
Down to number 1.
I really didn't. Number 1's the Omega. I really didn't.
Not in order of importance.
No, even though I'm counting down.
Or in order of dearness to your heart.
Yeah, maybe so. So even though I'm counting down, there's really no order to this. This isn't maybe the most important one, but it is a special one to me because I love the history of the Apollo missions, Gemini mission, and Mercury missions. One of the reasons I love that so much is because I am a big government contracting history fan, and the Apollo missions are one example of, a really good example of government and industry working really well together, even with hiccups, to achieve something for humankind that the Americans did, thanks again to government contracts. So one example, I'll just use one example of this idea of the space age that the space race created and the billions of dollars that went in to support the Apollo mission. The Apollo mission in particular, which is the mission through Apollo 11 that took 2 humans to the moon. Because so much money was coming in, there was a lot of market participation. And at one point, they needed a watch, a wristwatch, to be able to withstand the rigors of space And so they did a competition for that wristwatch. And some of the brands that, if you're a wristwatch fan, that you may recognize, Rolex submitted a watch, Longines submitted a watch, Hamilton submitted a pocket watch, so they didn't read the instructions very well. But then Omega submitted a watch. And again, it was a watch that was supposed to be for racing. It was called the Speedmaster. But that watch met all of the specifications and became the space watch. And even today, Omega wears that badge with pride. If you go to an Omega store, if you're into watches and you're in a very fancy mall and you see an Omega store, walk in, you'll see a picture of an astronaut somewhere. They have a huge NASA heritage. And so and again, that was due to competition. If they had just been handed the contract, it wouldn't have been as special. They earned that through these rigorous tests because NASA decided to compete. Now, this was something as simple as wristwatches, which created a whole sort of microeconomy within the wristwatch community, all through NASA. But the reality is that the space age created so much of an explosion of space-like things which have trickled into our own lives today. I mean, not just mattresses and pens, but really what we have is it created a culture at the time. Again, because of the pumping in of government funds and dollars to do these great things, we started capturing the young minds at the time in the 1960s. We have Disneyland and Walt Disney creating Tomorrowland and romanticizing space even more. We have Hanna-Barbera creating the Jetsons cartoon. A lot of this was influenced, absolutely influenced by government contracts and the government dollars that were coming in through NASA in particular for space exploration. Thanks, government contracts. All right, well, that's it. 5 government contract history things that changed your life. If you like this was a little bit off the cuff. But we thought some people may enjoy a little bit more of these unscripted little nuggets of contract history facts. Special thanks also to National Contract Management Association. I have a column on their contract management magazine called Looking Back. Check that out, where every month I provide government contract history and how we can learn from the lessons of the past to help us with future contract lessons in the future. Until next time, friends, good night.